As a general rule, the Kongo class had interesting lives. Pre-World War I battlecruisers that saw out that entire conflict, through the interwar years, and in one case, all the way through the Second World War. Refit to be what some consider fast battleships, they saw some of the harshest combat of the war, both in terms of surface actions and air attack. Of the class, the second member, Hiei, had one of the more interesting lives, going from a disarmed training ship, a favorite of the Emperor himself, to serving, and dying, off Guadalcanal. She was the first of her class lost to the war, but that is by no means a black mark on her career. One can make the argument her sister ships had the more exciting careers. But then, excitement isn't required to be interesting in a historic sense. Now, as is traditional, we will look a bit at the background of the Kongo class in its own right. Only in basic terms, though, as that will be covered in far greater detail with the name ship herself. The launch of HMS Invincible, the first battlecruiser, caused a certain amount of interest across the world. You can see this in the German response with von der Tann as an obvious example, but also in the Japanese Navy. While the Anglo-Japanese alliance was in full force, practically brand new in fact, that didn't stop Japan from wanting a better ship than Invincible. Even allies will want the best thing in the world, regardless of if the competition is with an ally. Unfortunately for Japanese ambitions here, Japan was not quite up to building a completely home-built and designed battlecruiser, at least at that point. The result would be Japan going to Vickers in the UK, commissioning a design from one George Thurston. This design would be basically an improved Lion in a lot of ways, though it also went through multiple iterations. The two most well-known ones probably being what a certain gaming company called Ishizuchi, and then the final design of Kongo. Vickers Design 472, the initially accepted design, mounted 5 twin turrets, each equipped with 305mm 12-inch guns, that were all mounted on the center line, 2 super firing on the bow, 2 super firing on the stern, and 1 right behind the superstructure. This was a more efficient layout of guns, on top of having more of them, in comparison to other first-generation battlecruisers. It was, however, ditched fairly quickly. Between Lion's 13.5-inch guns, and in anticipation that the United States would move to a 14-inch weapon soon, the Japanese went back to Vickers. They requested a redesign, losing one of the turrets in favor of increasing the size of the guns. 8 of the new 14-inch gun would be fitted to the design in the end. The resultant ship, named Kongo, would be the last Japanese capital ship built abroad, and in spite of superficial similarities to HMS Tiger, is not related to that design. At least not that I've been able to find. Right, with that out of the way, we can move on to the second ship in the class, Hiei. Hiei was laid down on November 4th, 1911, in the Yokosuka Naval Yard. While she was put together in a Japanese shipyard, a large portion of the materials used in her construction were still of British origin. This makes her an interesting case of a mismatch of foreign and domestic materials built in a domestic yard. This seemed to have little impact on her later career, though, and the same went for her actual construction. The new battlecruiser was launched on November 21st, 1912, making for a fairly quick construction time of 1 year plus a couple weeks. Her commissioning would follow on August 4th, 1914, meaning she got to enter service right as the Great War was kicking off. Before we get into the relatively little she did in that conflict, let's talk technical details for the gearheads out there. Hiei, as built, displaced something like 27,000 tons, though the exact tonnage varied between the ships and her class. On that displacement, she mounted the aforementioned 8 14-inch guns and 4 twin turrets. She retained the initially designed pair of superfiring turrets on the bow, but deleted one of the superfiring pair on the stern. Instead, she had the staggered layout of 2 turrets on the aft center line that is so visibly similar to HMS Tiger. Supporting this is a heavy, for the time, secondary battery of 16 single 6-inch 152mm guns, with 8 mounted to either side of the ship in casements. This heavy battery, in both number of barrels and size of guns, was due to Japanese concerns of torpedo boat attack, which is amusing in context of a certain video on the Russo-Japanese War. It also showed an early sign of Japan's preoccupation with torpedoes, further reflected in Hiei mounting no fewer than 8 submerged torpedo tubes. Hiei and her sisters also had a remarkably heavy anti-aircraft armament for their day and age, though the numbers do vary. A number I've seen cited is 4 3-inch guns on pedestal mounts. Alternatively, I've also seen as high as 8 or even 16, though I am personally very doubtful of that latter figure. Regardless, all of this weaponry was mounted to a hull with a waterline belt ranging from 3 to 8 inches, 76 to 203mm in thickness, with a 1-inch thick deck. Hiei's no fewer than 36 boilers could produce 64,000 shaft horsepower and get her up to 27.5 knots, which is admittedly quite fast for the time. With those technical features done, for the moment, we can go back to service history. As mentioned, her time in the Great War would see little in the way of action. For all that it would eventually be dubbed the First World War, there was actually very little going on in the Pacific. Japan declared war on Germany on August 23, 1914, quickly seizing German Pacific Islands. Further operations would secure German colonial holdings in China, though even this was done before the year was out. Through all of this, Hiei spent her time on training missions and the like. The Royal Navy, off and on, requested some or all of the Kongo class on loan, but Japan was understandably resistant to that idea. As a result, Hiei did not see any grand naval battles, or any naval battles at all, really. In common with Japan in general, the Great War was a quiet one for her. The same could be said of her career in the 1920s, which continued to largely consist of training missions and patrol duty. With no naval enemy to speak of, and Japan's military adventures largely limited to an ill-fated intervention in the Russian Civil War, Hiei had little to really do. She would receive a small refit in December 1923 that increased the elevation of her guns, and earlier in the same year, she also aided in rescue work following the Great Kanto earthquake in September. Otherwise, she simply continued her usual routine. Not that this is a bad thing, not at all, since she still performed valuable training roles. There's just not a huge amount to talk about here. Her career would only really deviate from her sister's following the first major reconstruction for the class. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, each of the Kongo class underwent major reconstruction. They swapped their old boilers for newer models, allowing for the removal of one of their smokestacks, while also making some fairly minor updates to their armor schemes. Hiei, however, missed out on this, at least for the most part. She lost most of her boilers, dropping her speed to 18 knots and losing one of her funnels. Her aft 14-inch turret was removed, along with all of her torpedo tubes and her armor belt. She would initially retain her 6-inch guns, though these would also be removed eventually. The reason for this? The Washington Treaty. Japan had to take Hiei out of service to comply with limitations there, and instead of scrapping a still useful ship, the Japanese converted her to a training ship. This was similar to what the United States would do with multiple battleships over the interwar period, with one major exception. The Japanese put Hiei's removed armor and weaponry into storage and preserved them in a warehouse for a rainy day. When this conversion was done, Hiei was down to 2 stacks as mentioned, and very visibly distinct from her sisters, with her lack of a stern turret and armor belt. The reconstruction would finish in 1932, at which point Hiei became a full-time training ship, instead of just going on training cruises as an active warship. For most of the 1930s, this is the role she would perform, with the notable exception that, in 1933, she was refit again to allow her to serve as the Emperor's personal ship. An imperial yacht, if you will. As the quote-unquote emperor's ship, Hiei would convey Hirohito on naval reviews and visits up and down Japan. This being said, time as emperor's ship and training duty would actually only last for a few years. Japan left the League of Nations in 1933 and would withdraw from the naval limitations treaties not much longer after that. Come 1937, the ship would receive the same modernization and complete rebuild as her sister ships. Again, for the most part. This consisted of fitting 11 new oil-fired boilers, bringing installed power up to 136,000 shaft horsepower. Coupled with rebuilding the stern to be 25 feet longer, and the ship can now make up to 30 knots on average. This was quite an increase on speed, even compared to her initial design, and made Hiei fast enough to keep up with the Japanese carriers. The rest of the rebuild saw her armor protection increased, insofar as her belt was brought to a uniform thickness of 8 inches. It did not actually increase past that point. Her deck armor, meanwhile, did increase up to 4.7 inches, 120 millimeters, at its thickest. She regained her aft turret, restoring her main battery, while 14 of her 16 6-inch guns were placed back aboard, with increased elevation. A similarly increased elevation on her main battery increased their effectiveness as well. Furthermore, her old anti-aircraft guns were replaced by 8 5-inch dual-purpose guns, alongside the first of her eventual swarm of 25mm cannon. In this case, 10 twin mounts for a total of 20 in all. All of these modernizations did lead to her being reclassified as a fast battleship, though your mileage may vary on that. Her firepower remained largely the same, as did her armor protection, with only her speed and deck armor being notably different. If you consider her a battleship or a battlecruiser at this point, well, again, your mileage may vary. Regardless, the main difference with the rebuild of her sisters would be the superstructure. Hiei was the last to be rebuilt, and her bridgeworks were rebuilt as, functionally, a prototype of what would eventually be fitted to Yamato. This is the easiest way to tell her apart from her sisters in images from World War II. This rebuild would be completed in January 1940, at which point Hiei properly rejoined the Imperial Japanese Navy, complete with an Imperial Naval Review in October, which saw the Emperor once more aboard the warship. Following this, the remainder of 1940, and the vast majority of 1941, would be spent around Japanese waters, sailing and training with her sister ships in Battleship Division 3. It would only be in November of 1941 that things substantially changed again. At this point, she would join with a good chunk of the Japanese fleet in preparing for the attack on Pearl Harbor. Her role in said attack would be minor, though. Hiei, alongside her sister Kirishima, served as escorts for the carriers. This is a common role for the Kongos, as they were the only Japanese capital ships that could, mostly, keep up with the carriers. As escorts, though, they saw no action during this attack, all of that being by carrier aircraft, with none of the ships engaged with direct combat with American forces. The same could largely be said about the rest of the early actions in the war. Hiei would spend most of her time escorting the carriers. The first time she really fired her guns in anger would be on March 1st, 1942, when she joined with the other carrier escorts in firing on the old USS Etzel. This was during the Java Sea campaign, when it was wrapping up after Allied forces had been shattered. Unfortunately for all the training her crew went through, she's failed to land any hits. It ended up requiring carrier aircraft to hit Etzel first, before the shelling took any real effect. Hiei, in particular, fired some 210 14-inch and 76-inch shells at the old destroyer. For reference, her sister Kirishima fired 87 and 62 respectively. It would, as it turns out, not be the last time a destroyer got the better of Hiei. For the time being, though, she would continue her carrier escort duties after this point. Moving from the Java Sea to the Indian Ocean, she would join with her sister ships in escorting the carriers on the Indian Ocean raid in April. This was, though it couldn't have been known at the time, the last time the four sisters would operate together. While the carriers once more did their job, Hiei had little to really do. None of the escorts did. One can perhaps forgive the Japanese for getting a little high on victory disease at this point. Of course, the next major action for Hiei was the Battle of Midway in June, so there is that to keep in mind. In this, Hiei and Kirishima were once more paired up as part of the admittedly optimistic invasion force. As such, they took no direct part in the carrier action and were pulled back with the rest of the Japanese fleet when it became apparent Midway was a failure. She would be rerouted to support the Aleutians campaign instead, though again, no combat would follow. For the rest of her active career, Hiei returned to various escort duties, be it carrier escort or supporting her sisters in bombarding Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Her moments of real, proper combat would come in the course of this. On November 13th, 1942, Hiei was part of the Japanese fleet for the naval battle of Guadalcanal. In this engagement, Hiei would be in the thick of the action. After a scramble to reload her guns and reorganize her magazines with armor-piercing shells after sighting the American fleet, Hiei opened fire at roughly 1:50 a.m. The following action is a bit of a mess, to put things lightly, though Hiei would fire upon USS Portland, among other ships. For her part, Portland probably hit Hiei back. Unfortunately for her, Hiei's woes were just beginning, as several American destroyers proceeded to launch torpedoes and pound her with their 5-inch guns. Most famous here probably being USS Laffey. This brave little destroyer closed to point-blank range, so low that Hiei couldn't depress her guns to fire back, and proceeded to hose down the Japanese ship's superstructure with just about every gun aboard. While this didn't exactly deal fatal damage, it did wound the admiral in charge and threw the Japanese fleet into even greater chaos. Nonetheless, Hiei was still combat capable and would fire on Laffey when the destroyer was further away. She would also fire on the American cruisers, though they would fire back in turn. Portland and San Francisco hit Hiei several times, with the most damaging of these being a shell that damaged her steering gear. This jammed the Japanese warship's port rudder to starboard and flooded her aft steering compartment. Unsurprisingly, at this point the operation to bombard Henderson Field was called off, and the Japanese pulled back. They lost 2 destroyers, and Hiei was crippled. Not yet sunk, but certainly going nowhere fast. Attempts to tow her to safety were hampered severely as morning came, and with it American aircraft. While Hiei would, wallowing in a sea of cripples, fire upon the equally crippled USS Aaron Ward, it did little good. One could consider it a last act of defiance. By that night, Hiei's fate was largely sealed. Carrier and land-based aircraft attacked her over the course of the day, and would see her hit by multiple bombs and torpedoes. The accumulated damage prompted first an attempt to beach her, and then, ultimately, her scuttling by Japanese destroyers. In spite of a belated order by Admiral Yamamoto himself to not scuttle her, Hiei would sink sometime that night, taking nearly 200 of her crew with her. Considering the pounding she took, one can say that losing so few men is a bright spot for Hiei. Even so, she ended up becoming the first Japanese battleship, or battlecruiser depending, to be sunk in the Second World War. This is not a happy fate, considering how little real action she had seen up to that point. Hiei's wreck would eventually be discovered by RV Petrol in 2019, northwest of Savo Island. Much as with Kirishima, Hiei lies upside down, with her bow blown away. In the end, Hiei may have been sunk in her first real action, but that doesn't erase all her time on training duties. Many of Japan's finest officers would have been trained aboard her at some point or another. That's a legacy that should not be forgotten. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.